Very cool.
Thank you.
I was listening in. You were explaining everything very well.
And we are live.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the Data Leaders Summit. And my name's Chris Primesberger, and I'm an editor at ZDNet, which is one of the larger tech sites in the world, has been for a while. I'm a former editor of eWeek for a long time, and now I'm doing other things, including moderating panels like this one for Satori, and I'm enjoying doing this. So thank you for joining us, and you're all data thought leaders, or you wouldn't be here probably. So we're glad you're with us. And we're going to be talking for the next 45 minutes or so about a topic that is really important to everybody, and that's data engineering. And we're at this executive roundtable. We'll be talking about a lot of different aspects of high-level data engineering for hypergrowth companies. And we have our panelists with us right now, and if possible, could you each introduce yourselves? James, Yoav, David, and Anita, and you probably already are familiar with Anita if you were listening to the opening session, but go ahead, Anita, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Happy to. Thank you so much. Anita Lynch. I am a Chief Data Officer. I'm also an investor in Satori. I met these wonderful founders early in their journey, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the discussion. I also sit on one corporate board, and I do, various other things like hiking and yoga for fun. So, gotta keep it balanced out here.
Thank you. James, go ahead. James, can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you said David. I'm currently, and James Richards, obviously, I'm currently an engineering manager for DP, data platform and business intelligence at Tractable, who are an AI and computer vision scale-up. I have been working in data and analytics for about 10 years, mostly across manufacturing, healthcare, and the financial services sector. Similar to Yoav, as you can probably see in the background, I enjoy strumming the guitar. I also live near the coast, so occasionally get in the water to go for a surf. That's me.
Well, Yoav, I was on.
Yeah, I can go next. Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Yoav Cohen. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Satori. I've been leading software, data, and research teams globally for the past 15 years. Prior to founding Satori, I was the senior vice president for product development for a company called Imperva. I joined Imperva as part of an acquisition of a startup called Incapsula. We used to process a ton of data at Incapsula. We did some really, really great stuff there. Also, some really cool learnings. Really passionate about large-scale operations, engineering, and delivering things to customers and seeing them use what we build for them. Builder at heart, and as James mentioned, love playing the guitar and other water-related stuff. Thank you for having me.
We're going to have to jam sometime because I've been playing guitar since I was 16. So maybe we can all get together sometime. And David, finally, how about you?
David Ashirov here. Very happy to join all of you. Currently a Chief Data Officer at OneVet, now in veterinary medicine. Immediately prior, I was at Freshly in freshly prepared food delivered to your doors. Prior to that, I was with General Assembly delivering education, and prior to that with IEC for some time. In all of these places, VP of data, more or less.
Very good. We've got data engineering experts. Love it. And for a person like me, I'm learning along with everybody else out there, you, all your viewers. So I'm taking notes here too, as furiously as maybe some of you are. So this is good. It helps me in my coverage and helps me do my job in explaining these things. So let's go right into it. Again, we have about 35, 40 minutes left here. We're going to do this right now. And I'll pose the question, and I would just say for each of my panelists, whoever feels strongly about it, just jump right in and answer it. And don't feel you have to answer every question. Every person has to answer every question. But the ones you're close to, please do. Okay, so let's start off with a jump ball here, to use a basketball analogy. What keeps you up at night regarding the data security and privacy for your organization? That's high level enough for probably all of you to jump in. Who'd like to go first? If you don't, I'll assign you.
Yeah, I can start.
There you are.
So you look at some of the recent breaches that were publicly shared in the past few months, and you see that hackers or the bad actors, they're not trying to break the vault. They're trying to trick the security guard into giving them the keys. So what that tells me is that we can build thicker and thicker walls around our data, but that's not going to be enough. That's very static. There has to be a door. And as folks who are keepers of data, I believe we have to invest more in more dynamic types of controls for data that take into account many inputs and variables and things when they make a security decision. And that's something that you see all over the place in the digital world. You see it when you pay with your Apple Pay or Google Pay or whatever. You see it when you rent a car. You see it when you connect into a server. In the data domain, however, that has not yet happened. It's still very much around static controls that are not really taking into account enough input, enough behavior, enough things from what we call the zero trust domain. I believe that's going to change in the future, but that really keeps me up at night, that we think that we're all secure because we build those really thick concrete walls, but then there's always a door and someone can get through. That's just my 2 cents.
Thanks.
And I might develop that idea a little further. Very often people buy other people's credentials, pay one-to-one Bitcoin for the use of, multi-factor authentication plus the logins, and unabated guided tour through data assets within, the guard's domain. That is happening. There are outlets where people could just monetize data of any kind. And one of the more interesting ways of getting on the front page of the magazines is keeping those doors wide open. And again, as you have mentioned, all of this can be prevented by observing what normal behavior is and what abnormal behavior is, and acting in real time versus setting up the traps and thickening the doors and creating a lot of process that taxes everyday quote unquote citizens.
Okay, good. James or Anita?
I can jump in. So for me, I think the biggest concern I have is around just general organizational understanding of what your responsibilities are as a data owner or data producer. I'm constantly surprised by people still not necessarily understanding what PII actually is, and their responsibilities when it comes to taking ownership of data around who they're granting access to, the decisions they're making about whether they need, the full history of some data set or something along those lines. So for me, I think a lot of particularly in a scale up, a lot of the consideration is around making sure everyone understands what their commitments are, what their responsibilities are, so that you can start to federate out some of this effectively, which obviously tools like Satori help do. So yeah, I think that's my main concern.
I agree with everything that everyone said so far. I think earlier in my career, the things that kept me up at night were, just quite literally stuff breaking. And, because it literally wakes you up at night, like, something breaks and someone calls you because something somewhere is not available when someone needs it. And so, it literally wakes you up. As in the last, I think, few years, the things have shifted a bit, and it's partly that, but it's also, accepting that things are going to break. That's just the reality. We need to have clear accountability for when things do break, like who's going to be the person to take responsibility for it. And I think that's a little bit of what, what James was saying. I think there's also this broader sort of sense of accountability to demonstrate that, because in most companies, technology, unfortunately, engineering, or IT or IT can be considered a cost center. There's this responsibility to demonstrate that there's a true return on investment for the dollars that are being spent, and, demonstrating how things are moving the business forward. So showing that also means that just, again, human nature, folks tend to remember the thing that happened most recently that was bad related to IT or data, in the conversation around, what next investment is going to be required in order to kind of push the needle forward to fuel innovation, to fuel scale, to fuel growth. And so I tend to try to get ahead of that. And so what keeps me up at night is more about, who is the person or the people responsible for fixing things, when they break, not if, but when they break. And then also, how can we, collectively make sure that we have solutions in place that then actually, can address issues, when they arise, and proactively maybe prevent them. And so I would put, solutions like Satori in that category because of, the issues that have been already called out.
Very good. Taking all of this into account, why don't we take up this conversation to the next level, which means scale. What is it that worries you all about scaling up your data operations to support innovation and growth, especially growth right now, with just the multitude of attack surfaces and various areas in which you've got to support security? What is it about scaling up that kind of worries you? Who would like to hit that first? David.
I think the only thing that's really, in a way, is lack of standards, lack of integrations, lack of best practices being exported by people who really worry about things. Right now, we have almost unlimited compute power, almost unlimited software as a services everywhere that can solve for every possible problem or scenario. So people do get very enthusiastic about various kinds of integrations, and in that process there are no standards. Things are just bolted on top of other things, which is probably a reincarnation of something that happened 20-25 years ago initially, just another phase of it. But in this rush to the stockpile, we kind of not paying attention to best practices, integrations, standards, understanding what is safe and what is not.
Yeah. So you're saying it's basically the Wild West out there right now, and it probably could be that way for a while because standards are notoriously slow and coming to the fore, correct?
Correct, but standards come from conversations. Standard come from ongoing work, working group, a little bit of investment, industry investment, and understanding where those standards are lacking. Right, it's not something that gets coined for 10 years or 20 years. It's an ongoing process. Today, we are happily living in a world with daily releases, daily updates, daily upgrades. It doesn't have to be painful.
Okay. Who else would like to jump in there?
Yeah, I can comment. I think for me, you can summarize the biggest challenge, the biggest concern in terms of scaling up is like two words: self-service, or more broadly, this kind of federated ownership model, because it's absolutely crucial to scale up effectively, because it's simply a resource question, right? But at the same time, often the organization doesn't necessarily know the extent of what that entails. It's a lot more than just giving people easy access to creating dashboards. You know, it's everything around security. It's around developing people's competence. It's around governance. It's around data reliability, quality, providing like a data platform as a service, cost, performance management, accountability, contracts between services that exchange data. So there's a huge number of things that you need to solve there. But if you do that effectively, then the kind of self-service model, federated ownership of data, federated ownership of analytics, is a massive, massive catalyst for business sort of growth and success. And it continues to amaze me that when that's done effectively, like what people can do when you kind of get out of the way as a data function, and let them add the value, and work with the data in ways that's much more, I guess, that they're closer to, that they understand and can apply to a business concern or a business opportunity.
Yoav or Anita? You guys.
There's a little bit of a delay. Yeah, I had a very intense experience with scale around the time that Disney Plus was being launched. We had about 3 million customers in the Netherlands as part of our tech test in September of 2019. And then by the US launch in November, so just a few weeks later, we had something like 25 million customers. And so when I think about scale, it's not just about sort of internally scaling, you know, the platform. It's also about serving, you know, customers more effectively and making sure that, you know, systems are reliable and that there are, you know, as I said, you know, ways to ensure, you know, business systems reliability as well as data systems reliability. So, you know, in those scenarios, I think the biggest risk often is the one that you don't anticipate. It's the one that, you know, catches you off guard. It's, you know, something that sits outside of your plan, something you didn't know was a dependency. You know, it might be a vendor system. It might be, you know, a partner. It might be, you know, a point of integration. It might be a flaw in the logic of something that at a small scale doesn't really matter, but then once you know, put a lot of volume through it, it actually, you know, kind of explodes. And so from that perspective, I think the main thing that that needs to happen in order to enable scale is to actually not only try to test it, but also to ensure that you have you know, just a backup plan for again, like anticipating not if, but when things, you know, go wrong internally or externally, you know, with your partners, et cetera. You have folks, you know, going to be able to address, you know, all of those challenges and issues.
Yeah, how scale up affects not only your company, but all your partners and your, you know, everybody you work with. It's extremely complicated. Thanks for talking about that. Appreciate it. Yoav, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I was exposed to scale in the pre-cloud era and the post-cloud era. So it's really fun having those two perspectives. At the Encapsula days, which was kind of like 10 years ago, pre-cloud or cloud data stores were just ramping up. It was very hard to just keep up with the growth of the company and the business. We were collecting weblogs, basically everything you do on a website, from across millions of websites, you know, hundreds of millions of website visitors. dozens of data centers across the world. We had to ship all the data, process it. It was all homegrown stuff that we built. And we didn't have all the mature platforms that folks have today, like Snowflake and Redshift and BigQuery and Databricks and all the big names. So we had to, take care of disks filling up and optimize for compute and ship servers and whatnot. In the post-cloud era, which is what we do now in Satori, and I'm overseeing our data operations in Satori, it's very much different, and it's more about how can I scale my data productivity? How can I do my data science versus how I don't have to worry. The cloud providers, the data store providers, they take care of all the hard stuff. But then I have to think about how do I structure my data environment, my controls, my processes, so that my data engineering, my data science, my analytics teams can run and deliver data products faster. That's a harder problem to solve. There's no blueprint for that. I think it ties back to what David said. We don't have a clear model yet on how to do that effectively. I think we will. I don't know, 10 years from now, we'll probably have some sort of an equivalent of Scrum or Kanban or something like we have for software engineering, we'll have for data. I don't know what that's going to be like. I hope to be part of that movement, but yeah, it's very different pre and post cloud, and the concerns are different.
Yeah, something that David, go ahead.
I might add a few words. So I think one of the bigger problems is the lines on the sand that we put and the silos that we create, where this special group of people is only creating reports for internal consumption, and that special group is only creating processes and models for internal consumption. But then we need to expose that. Then it needs to be in front of the customer. And suddenly we're in front of a system that's built for a very special use case where you trust more than you mistrust, and suddenly it needs to be customer facing. It needs to it needs to monitor for scan the content and do something, ratings, categorization, user facing. Suddenly everything you built it for is no longer working, right? But there is that need of bleeding into here and into there. We never build, or less often than not, we start building rocket ships and very complicated, very optimized workflows that may or may not in the future be stress tested by hypergrowth, right? And we need to pay attention at which point you start optimization, at which point you need to throw things out and re-engineer them and not be afraid to do so.
Right. Something that's occurring to me now in our chat discussion, we're talking about trust here, but I'm also looking at a discussion about zero trust. And I was thinking back to when David was talking about standards. So let me put this, question out there just real quickly for each of you. Do you all feel that zero trust will eventually become a standard in all of this, or what? What do you think?
Again, lines in the sand. You don't overbuild things. When you prove yourself as a small startup, you need to prove the business model, you need to prove the value proposition to the customers, and people do not build rocket ships day one. You just don't have the time. It's not something you pull off the shelf. It's not something that's as a standard already exists and big boys already invested in, and there you go. You have to think about it. You have to work with it, and it takes time, it takes resources, and you need to focus on something else. So things do not start with rocket ships. Things starts with a broom and dust, and then you need to graduate step by step by step.
Are you saying that zero trust is a de facto standard right now because everybody's using it, or what?
So zero trust is it's not a standard. It's an approach to security. So there's no spec. There are principles. There are implementations of zero trust. I, by the way, totally relate and resonate to what David said. You start with something, but as technology matures, your starting point is much more advanced. So when we started in Capsula, Eldon and I were part of the founding team, like we had different security standards than what we have now with Satori, because it's been 10, 12 years, so things have evolved. For example, we have zero trust built in from our cloud provider, and we have single sign-on, a lot of good stuff that 10 years ago you had to have like an IT team to implement. So that's why I'm optimistic. I wouldn't be a founder otherwise, but I think that the startups of 10 years from now in the future will probably have zero trust for data or other really cool stuff, helping them work with their data much more productively than what we are able to do today, because they'll have all that great technologies just out of the box.
Okay, James or Anita, you have a comment, or should we move on?
I'll just quickly say that someone mentioned, the least privilege access, and I like that as a principle. I agree with what Yoav said and what David said. I think ultimately, Series C and later is probably when companies are starting to think about scale a lot more. Usually at that point you've got a product market fit. And sort of what it is you're scaling at that point. And so that's when the technology decisions that you're making start to have more long-term ramifications. And that's the point at which, I usually coach founders to start, being a little bit more thoughtful about how they are approaching not only technology decisions and architectural principles, but also, culture and cultural norms around, how data is going to be managed and how access is going to be managed. For example, if you were to, sort of in the early days, make it possible for everyone in the company to have access to all of the customer data, everyone in the company might only be like, 25 people. But once you get to a point where it becomes, 125 people, then you no longer have sort of, very close knowledge of everyone's kind of role and what they're doing and why. And so those are the times when, these things need to be kind of sewn into the fabric of the technology and the cultural norms.
Okay. All right. James, do you want to comment, or should we move on?
Yeah, sorry, I was having slight network issues there. I think in general, it's a sound principle. I think the only consideration is that the management of security at scale is something that you need to be aware of. And at the end of the day, I think you need to trust people to some extent to manage the definitions about their own data. So if I'm a team and I produce some data, that I'm accountable for that, and I'm accountable for who has access to it.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. For our next question, data engineering and platform leaders have a lot of competing priorities and limited resources. Are there compelling reasons to design the data security as part of data operations? And if so, why now? Who would like to hit that? James, go for it. You're muted. There you go.
Yeah, sure. This resonates with something Anita said a little earlier, that you can only really understand the magnitude or appreciate the magnitude of your data security issues after they've already manifested as major incidents. And that's something that we only really learn from experience, and obviously that's too late. So I think much like tech debt, data security has to be baked into the fabric of what you do. It has to be baked into the organizational norms of how you operate as a team or an organization that is responsible for data. So it should have regular slots on sprints. It should be something that organizationally is a priority and reflected on at all times.
Who'd want to hit that next, David?
I want to also develop on Anita's ideas of the past. Yes, you need to build it in from day one. Data security, there are some principles you must put in place and adhere to, knowing and learning from other people's mistakes. And you need to, as you have said, be prepared to to be hit at any time and any moment, and you have to have a posture of not perfection unachievable, right? You can think that you are the best in the world. You can think that you thought of everything and you've learned everything, and every tool you could have used is employed, but someone will find a way to prove you wrong. It will happen. So every day you show up for work, you should be prepared for that day to be the day when you learn that somebody's sitting in your systems and eroding your control over information you amassed. The day when someone makes a public giggling at your expense, and you need to behave in a way as to preserve your control. When do you lose your control? When you forget where you put stuff. You forget where you put stuff, it's there, you don't look at it. It's not part of any inventory. It's not part of any quarterly review. It's a dust bunny that sits under your desk. It sits there, and it is the feed for which people come. You don't know it's there. That's not a great idea. So self-destruction is a very good thing. Same as principle of least privilege, principle of you don't use it, lose it. And if you don't want to lose it, make sure you use it, right? Big data gave us 10 years ago this idea that if you sit and you hoard and you put things and you hide things and you just collect things, maybe 10 years from now that Facebook pixel will create a perfect audience for you, but maybe not. Don't sit on that, and don't give third parties opportunity to collect on your behalf. Just destroy the data. Remember how you got to it. Remember that you can recreate it, but keep it as a code. Keep it as a relationship with somebody where you can go and recreate it. Don't keep dust bunnies around. They tend to multiply, and they tend to invite other people into your domain, right? Same with everything else. Behaviors. People who do not usually do X should not suddenly do X. Okay. If somebody wants to change their behavior, if somebody needs access, somebody needs to scan the entire database of all relationships you ever had with every single supplier and a customer, it would be prudent to ask them, is this for real? Are you the right person to do that? Under what circumstances you're trying to do it? It's a 5-minute conversation that will help a lot of people not to look very foolish in front of the entire world.
I guess we all have.
I'll piggyback
We all have
on some of what he was saying.
we all have dust bunnies we have to deal with, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we all want growth, and growth is primarily driven by our friends in sales and our friends in marketing. And oftentimes, they're under tremendous pressure to, kind of reach out to customers, understand what they're doing, understand who they are, understand what their needs are, and then, position and make visible the products that many of us on the calls are helping to build and kind of, power very quickly. And so I have a lot of empathy for them, because I think, more often than not, some of the dust bunnies that we're talking about actually, what is that old saying? Like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like, they have good intentions. They're trying to understand customers. They're trying to understand what they need. And so they stick, and oftentimes they don't ask, right? And they'll just put things into places, and maybe they have permission to do this. Maybe they, seek forgiveness later. But ultimately, I think audit, also helps with some of the challenges that Dave is talking about, because you can't always sort of know everything that's happening, especially in the early days. And folks, especially on the startup side, but even in companies, the entrepreneurial mindset is something that's very highly valued. And so if people have an opportunity to try something new and get that extra edge, be the early adopter or the one to experiment with something, they will. And so, but sometimes memories are short, but the risk that's created from adopting new technologies is very long lasting. And I think that's a lot of the point that David's trying to make. So another counterbalance to that, since we're all kind of in the same boat and want to see the company scale and the customer reach scale, and that's why we're scaling our systems. We also have to be prepared to kind of go back and audit for things that we don't know. I think it was is it David Rumsfeld who said there's sort of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and so there will always be unknown unknowns once an organization gets to a certain size, once your tech internal tech systems and platforms get to a certain size. And so you have to be prepared to kind of screen for the unknown unknowns.
Okay. And I might add that it's not that bad, and technology is here to help. Technology can monitor where you put stuff. Technology can monitor who's reading stuff, what the lineage of your stuff is, what is actually being used and what is actually not being used. And things can be encrypted, and you could accidentally forget a key, decryption key, because nobody used it for a period of time. And then things will self-destruct. So technology is here to help. It's not all in our heads. We can only operate on 5 variables at a time. Humans are not designed to keep track of things. That's why we live in a century we live in. That's why we are investing in the technology that we're building.
Very good. Any other comments? We've got about 8 or 9 minutes left in our discussion. I'd like to get to one more question if we could. And that would be this one. Let's see. How do you work with your security, privacy, and compliance teams for securing data access while honoring privacy and compliance requirements? That's the key one here today, I think. Who would like to hit that first? Put your hand up if you want, or don't.
I'll take it.
David and then Anita. Okay.
Really depends on who the size of the organization you're in. If you're flying on rocket ships or you're flying on brooms, really it's your level of maturity. You might have a lot of experience, but as an organization, you may not be in a position to, or not have a counterparty to rely on. Under those circumstances, you might become the security expert, and you might be that person holding the fort while an appropriate counterpart is being found, trusted, hired, put in place to only worry about security. In larger organizations, some of them I do consult occasionally. There are armies of highly trained, highly motivated security apparatus that will take you by the hand, will review your code, will put links, will make sure that every release you make on application security, for example, is to the standards, done right, that you have appropriate security mindful culture. It really depends on, can you find it in your investors' pockets or your customers' pockets, these resources to put this army together and to collaborate with them, right? Once those counterparties are found, it's just as any other task. It's just as any other camaraderie, right? You do your part, I do my part. We agree on how we're going to do it. We make it part of the culture. Nobody wants to deliver subpar ideas not wrapped in the right shell. Nobody wants to fly on an airplane full of holes in the wings. With appropriate people, you have appropriate attention to detail.
Okay, Anita, you put your hand up.
Yeah. I mean, David said it all, but so I personally just make the head of information security and honestly also the general counsel my best friends. And the reason behind that is because well, for one, I think the information security folks, especially at larger companies, are starting to get more visibility in front of boards. I think I was mentioning in the last session that the SEC is starting to question for larger companies, how much time they're actually spending in the board meetings on cybersecurity in particular. And there's some regulations I think that are out for review on what types of expertise boardrooms are going to need to have from cybersecurity experts actually being in the boardroom. And so they need help, they need support, because they're in the interesting situation of needing to own but not having complete authority over all of the things related to security, data security and information security for the company, from a system standpoint, from a workflow standpoint, et cetera. And so they need that help. And then to the point that was brought up in the chat, someone asked how to sell data governance, from day one. And I think the way that you sell it is to not sort of treat it as an optional thing. In other words, it shouldn't be something that you have to sell. It's something that's just part of the way that we do business. And, the best analogy is that, no one would question the need to have good accounting standards from day one, because everyone knows that in order to eventually get to a place where, you're recognized as a sound company in the way that you do business is to make sure that you have, good financials. And so it's the same thing. It's hygiene, related to data, and it's something that every company is going to need to take into account. Whether they're direct to consumer or B2B, they're going to need to have to account for how they treat data, how they manage it, how they secure it, because it is the most important asset. Every company today, people are saying is a technology company. I would argue, one step further, every company today is a data-driven company.
Anita, thanks for catching that in the comments there. I was going to bring that up. Selling the value of data governance early on is exactly the way you described it. It's as important as good accounting practices, et cetera. So a couple minutes left. Any more comments? Like James and Yoav, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, just to add to what Anita was saying. I think particularly when you're in your sort of startup to scale up phase, you won't necessarily have someone at leadership level who necessarily has that mentality towards data. And I think that there is an element that you do need to sell this. So it's an important consideration. But as a founder, I think, or a founding team, you should be very, very careful about when you appoint the person in leadership role that has that kind of mentality, and look for that quality in someone that really does prioritize data security as an absolute no-brainer, non-negotiable. Because once you instill that culture at the beginning, it just percolates through, because it is obvious to everyone that joins it that it does retain that kind of that level of seriousness. On a very kind of, to zoom in very specifically, one issue that I've repeatedly had, particularly when you engage B2B with different kinds of customers, is that contracts are often quite different, and your data obligations to those customers are often different depending on region, market, whatever it is, and establishing a framework for capturing kind of like a central point of truth for your customers as to what your obligations are, so that as a business you can all see that, is a really important thing to do, and something that's quite difficult to achieve and often left out. And then you end up sifting through contracts, and you're constantly having conversations around okay, well, what do we need to do around retention for this group of individuals, or in this region, or in this market, which is difficult and time consuming to resolve.
Okay. Yoav, you can have a last word if you like.
Oh, awesome. So it's honestly, I don't have the folks here on the call are really the real experts. I would just say, totally agree with James about these requirements becoming non-negotiable. I think it's part of our process of becoming more mature as an industry, that there are more things that we have to take care of as part of our operation. So, 100 years ago, you could open a restaurant without, having to comply to anything, right? But now you have to do all these things around your kitchen. We have to do the same around our operations. It's fine. It's not the Wild West anymore. We have to be responsible with the stuff that we do. We are building technology to help us do this more efficiently, more effectively. That's great. That's part of life goes on. And I think that as an industry, we'll get there. And 10, 15 years from now, we'll just have different problems to take care of.
Right. I want to thank each of our thought leaders here today, Yoav, James, Anita, and David, for their perspective on our Data Engineering Executive Roundtable, Data Engineering Best Practices from Hypergrowth Tech Startups. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for logging in and joining us today. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.